All right, so welcome everybody. So thank you for joining us on this Saturday, whatever, from morning to afternoon to evening. Today's subject has been labeled as the one related to feeding, but obviously what we're going to do, we are going to try to use this feeding, reflux, constipation, so the whole chain, right? So we're going to try to use this example as the basis for bigger points as well. What shall I start with? Actually, what I want to start with, I will do the screen sharing, and I'll start with a very, very simple picture and principle that I would like you to understand. All right, so whilst you are still fresh, right? So let me just get this point very, very clearly. So when we talk about the development of the child, you have to visualize things in this kind of scale like performance. So you see, first point, it's a self development. So the child is growing, the child is developing. So this is really the key thing to understand. What is our role? Our role is to help the child. But how are we going to help the child? So there are two ways of looking at it. So one is to say, oh, there are all these sorts of, pathologies and wrongs, and we'll try to sort of suppress them. But this approach, in fact, disregards the nature of this self-development, that there are millions and millions and millions of this sort of small processes which are happening to your child, like through the development. And that's why I believe that the best way is to look at the whole thing as this balance of scales. So what does it mean? That means that if we take a simple perspective, so effectively we have to look at the numbers, like the hours, right? So there are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So you see 168 hours per week. And during this time, there are certain things happening. So they either go, so the self-development in that sense, that it either goes on the, let's say that would be our green side, right? So you see that's the good side of the scales. So the things that are done in the right way. And there are things which are done in the wrong way. I'll use the word wrong just in a very broad sense. What is our task? Our task is to put as much as possible on this green side. And that consists of two things. One is to put those extra hours of work, right? So you see that's our would be our ABR hours. So what do we do through the ABR hours? We take those concentrated areas, right? So you see when the things are performed by the, like just most superficial, longest, and sort of strongest muscles, so the concentrations, and go for the distributions. In fact, this idea of right and wrong is very simple. So distributed is good, concentrated is bad. And if we get back to the green part, so we have the hours of ABR, right? So suppose you do 10 hours of ABR, right? So what does it mean? That means that you are putting 10 hours in the distributed fashion, but then you've got the 158 hours which are falling on the other side of the scale. So that's a challenge, right? So we have to realize, right? And I'm not going to tell you, oh, come on, guys, you have to do 30 hours or whatever, right? So you see, that means that we have to be realistic and understand, okay, so we have life to live, and the total kind of bigger picture, the bigger sort of family life with the child and so on. So in that sense, if we have those 10 hours, so we want the maximum kind of multiplication effect, so that our 10 hours will get, I don't know, the 10 times the benefit, 5 times the benefit, 20 times the benefit. So we want to scale these hours as much as possible so they give us that plus side of the equation. So that's one very simple idea. The other idea, which is absolutely critical here, is then we're looking at the self activities of the child, and then we want to select and highlight those activities, those self activities of the child that bring that distribution, that bring the best benefit on to this side of the equation. That's really another big point. This is the thing that we always have to keep in mind, right? Because we have to be realistic and we have to understand that, of course, the entire situation is emotional, is to a certain extent dramatic, but my basic message has always been is that what is the way to get the situation less dramatic is to bring more math, right? So you see, if we bring more math, the less drama, right? So you see, that's a very simple equation as well that we are keeping in mind. So we want to deconstruct things, we want to understand how they build, and we want just to be systematic in putting things on that side of the scale. So that's really the key picture. Does it mean that we are going to be perfect, that we are going to always go towards the, like super successes? Unfortunately not, because like we are dealing with a situation which has been very depleted from the start. There are lots of challenges there, but this is our kind of best take and our best bet on the situation, to be systematic on putting things on this green side of the scale. And of course, the other side, the other aspect there is not to put the things as much as possible on the wrong side of the scale, right? So these are our three big ideas in fact, four, right? So you see two big ideas, one big idea to put things on the right side of the scale, and the other one not to put it on the wrong side of the scale, right? And those rights and wrongs, they belong to your therapy efforts, and it belongs to the life choices and the self activities of the child. So we want to foster and maximize those aspects where the child is doing her or his best, their self activity, which is the most productive. And we want to facilitate this with the therapy aspect. And on the other hand, we want to kind of discourage as much as possible those self activities which are going on the wrong side of the scale. And of course, we don't want to do the extra therapies which are feeding the wrong side of the scale. So that's this big picture. And since we look at this big picture, so that's where our conversation about feeding comes in. That feeding is the very first, right? So eating itself is the very, very first primary thing that all of us start with. Of course, there is respiration that comes even before that, but in terms of the activity, in terms of the things which we impact, right? Because breathing is 100% automatic, but eating and feeding, that's a process which is facilitated by the others. The child has to be fed. So I want you to keep this image in mind, and that's really the main reason for, or the main lens to look at the entire feeding process. Because you see, when you look at feeding, usually there are two big ideas there, or the two big points there. So these are the pictures which were generously allowed us to use by Team Runner, so that where we can look at the way how the child does the activity, right? So you see here we can see she's feeding herself with the fork, and at first that looks like a great thing, right? So you see she is feeding herself, opening the mouth, getting the things into the mouth with the fork. So at first it looks like there is a great reason to celebrate. But then if we ask ourselves the question, so if we look at the feeding process, what would be the most productive, the most creative, and the most beneficial way of getting there? Remember, we looked at our scale and we wanted the multiplication factor, right? Multiplication factor, so that things which are happening here for a lesser number of hours, that they have some kind of multiplication. So multiplication 5 times, 10 times, and so on. So what does it mean? That means that the child is using, say, one area or doing one function, and that function contributes to the other areas. At the same time, from the time perspective, what you do today contributes to the creation of a potential for the things to develop in the future. So it becomes the foundation. So it's kind of this two lines. So today establishing the foundation for the future, so which provides the growth there. And on the other hand, from one area to multiply the impact into the other. So that's really what we keep in mind when we are discussing any kind of function that the child is doing. So now, from this lens, we look back on this and say, if we compare this feeding and this celebration with this. See, here she is eating with her hand. Look at that. See, I'm just going frame by frame. Look, fine aspects, fine movements of the fingers, precise delivery to the mouth, change of the hand position, closing it into the mouth, opening the hand, pushing it in, engaging the lips, holding on, using the other finger just to cover it, and then, some food, it becomes messy, so the food drops out partially. She catches up with the other hand, right? So you see, then closes it in, and then, continues. Something else falls in, so falls out, so she picks it up and goes another way. So you see, she's using the other hand. Now she's studying whatever item has fallen out, explores it, feeds it back into her mouth. So my question is, if we compare this activity with the first one, if I were the occupational therapist, what would I say? Wow, this is great. She has progressed to the usage of the tools. But I'm not an occupational therapist, right? Or she's eating the chunked food. I'm not an occupational therapist. So what I would say that this activity, when she is engaging her hands, lips, mouth, and so on for this complex coordination, if I compare the outcome, if I compare the benefits, they would be probably, 10 times in favor of this. So because as you have seen, we're getting a lot of key points here. So she's able to pick the things from the plate. She is using the distinct and variable function of her fingers. So she is adjusting that grip. Then she delivers it to the mouth. Then she meets the interface between the hand and the mouth. So for this, she needs to have an accurate perception where the item is. So then she has to bring it back without missing the mouth, right? So you see, then she has to explore the sensory part of the lips. So then she has to switch from the lips to the cheeks, to the tongue, to the whole swallowing process. If something falls out, that means that she has to feel it. catch it. We saw it, we've seen she's been doing it with the other hand. Then she switches the hand and uses different facets of her hand. She can use the fingertips, she can use the flat palm, she can use the middle of the palm, she can use it in a kind of cupped version, she can use it in a flat version. She switches between the two hands and so on. So in that sense, what we are seeing here, this is extremely diverse and extremely rich activity. So that's really what I want you to get, is that when we are discussing the feeding processes, and that obviously refers not just to the child who can be relatively good in her manual performance, right? So like a moderate condition child and relatively good in the hands-on performance, but that refers to the feeding of any kind. So we want to see feeding as your first entry door into the self activities, and we want to maximize that kind of ratio, that magnification, the scaling factor, how much benefit the feeding process brings, as opposed to the two typical ideas, right? So the typical idea number one, the child needs food, and we see it all the time, like mothers, helpers, grandmothers, and so on. People become extremely skilled in doing the quick feeding, like plum, 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 just basically it becomes like a feeding station. The mouth opens, the spoon gets in, then the spoon unloads, the child, blah, 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 okay, now the next thing is coming, the next thing is coming, the next thing is coming, and so on. So this process is like a feeding machine, or the feeding conveyor belt, is what I see from most of the parents. And there is a number of reasons for this. It's like, she's a messy eater, or, if I let her there, she would be here for an hour. That's one argument. The other one, well, but, like the food is tasty now, but if it gets cold, then it would be yucky. So probably the child wouldn't like it, which is actually not true, right? So you see, if the kid has the opportunity to play with the food, they actually tend to like it, whatever temperature it is. And the second consideration there is, of course, this thinking of stages. So you start with pureed food, then you move up to soft food, then you move up to chunks, then you move up to like larger chunks and different textures and so on. And then you move from being fed to using their feeding tools, whether it's the spoon, whether it's the fork, and so on. That's the thing that I really want you to keep in mind, that these are the typical, again, very utilitarian things. And I see this all the time. Parents do the quick feeding, or as quick as it could be, and then say, oh, okay, now let's do something useful. Let's do some reading, let's do some exercises, let's do some this. And so it's in that sense, you start thinking of that whole bunch of activities that you want to get for the child. So whether it's schooling, whether it's entertainment, whether it's movement, so all sorts of things that you are trying to bring instead of feeding. What I'm going to say today is really going completely against this. And I'm going to say that really what you have to understand, there is nothing better than feeding training. So there is nothing which has greater magnification. There is nothing that has greater benefits overall, not just for the feeding, but in its entirety. So that's an interesting part, right? So you see that, because even for those of you who appreciate maybe the slower feeding and so on, and the idea of better taste and food enjoyment and so on, so even for those of you who still do not appreciate the full benefits of self-explorative feeding. So let me just complete this sector with this part. See here, she is trying to explore the spoon, right? And she gets it not very right and so on, but she then manages to plant it. You see, look, even in this activity, you can see that the action itself is much simpler. But now let's look at feeding here. So first of all, I want to bring the attention at this total performance here. You see how much of the facial expressions you see there, and that's what you want to observe all the time, right? So you see that you want this richness of the mimic expressions. We'll get to this, so that stimulus there. You see here, that's a nice, super nice horizontal movement. That's a preparation and rounded opening of the mouth. But what we see here, you see, the moment she gets things through the spoon, what happens to the head? The head tilts back. And if we look back at this performance when she was doing it herself, what is the position of the head, right? I hope you remember our previous webinar on the head position. How important is the head flexion? We want to see the head flexion because that's the primary position. That's that, spiral of the head, locking, and that's what the main count goes from. You see, when she feeds herself, she minimizes. The eyes are rotated downwards and she minimizes that tilt of the head. You see, when she puts the food in her own mouth, it's very different from this activity when she's being fed with the spoon, because it's very difficult when you do the feeding, right? So you automatically tend to do it at the height which is comfortable for you, and the child has to adjust into this position. Don't be surprised that after a while the child gets fidgety and so on and so forth. So I really want you to appreciate all these aspects, the much larger context of the feeding process. So now let's make a next move and switch to the next level. So we're going to do a little bit of discussion on the new neurology, which is associated with this gentleman by the name of Carl Friston. So he is the most cited, the most widely quoted neuroscientist of the world. And he's in this position by a big margin. And he's sort of one of the closest in line for the Nobel Prize and so on. So he came up with the cryptic and complicated theory of the free energy, right? So you see that the minimization of the free energy. I'm not going to go into all the details there. It's really quite handful. So, but the basic idea there, I'll just give you the basic points there. That the brain itself is the one which focuses on the actions that are external. So the brain figures out and predicts what happens externally. In other words, the brain is a kind of outwardly oriented system which makes sense of the surrounding space and does actions there. Now, the important thing about it is that when we get into this part, he has this specific term which is called surprisal. It's rather technical, but in fact we can take it in a very simple way as the element of surprise. How unexpected is the activity? You've got the external world or you've got the function, so the difficulty of the task is proportional to the element of novelty and unexpectedness and surprisal. Now think about what is the most surprising task that you can possibly have from your interaction of your body with the external environment. And if you think about it through very well, it's going to be feeding. Why? Because every movement that you do, it happens inside. The movement within the joint is internal. So by definition, there is a lot less unexpected. It's done within the body, like you cannot do, the potential for something unexpected is very limited. It's all happening within a very defined range. Yes, you've got your hands and you've got your feet that got the contact with the ground. So that's where there is a significant component of surprisal which might come out as well. But what is the least expected thing that you're dealing with? That's food. Because food is always external, right? So your mouth, as you get the thing in, you are always dealing with the potential surprise. Surprise, it's not going to be of large scale, but it could be surprisal density, surprisal texture, surprisal closure of the teeth, surprisal opening, sticking and so on, because food is external to you. And that's really the very, very big consideration. Because the next important point that comes from Mr. Friston, so the idea is that the brain is a universal controller. So, which means that it deals with the external environment according to this surprisal. So, meaning that the performance of the brain is the interpretation of all sorts of those external things. Distance, depth, reach, tracking, angular position, sequences, velocities, accelerations, and so on. So those things are happening outside. Let me just get back maybe here so that you would appreciate this part. So when she is doing all these activities, right? She has to judge relative position from the eyes to the thing, relative position of her hand, relative position of the mouth, relative position of the eyes, relative position of the head, and she has to put all this stuff together. And then as she moves her hand to the mouth, right, she has to do this rotation of the hand, that scooping thing. She shouldn't miss the mouth, right? So it shouldn't be like that, boom, boom, and getting the food into the eye, right? Or missing it by, bringing the food into the ear. By the time she comes to the mouth, she has to slow down and stop. As the food comes in contact with the lips, she has to stop, sense it from the lips, sense it from the hand at the same time. Then, as she passes it in, she shouldn't put it too far, right? So then, but as she puts it in, she has to release it. That's the next point, right? Releasing the food. Then, as she releases it, and she has to grab it with the mouth and pass it on. So I want you to see this kind of mix of things, the cascade of the combinations. How complex is this action? And if we get back to this point, right? So you see, this is where we are looking once again at this slide. So the brain is a universal controller. And this is my point, that the brain within itself is showing its best. The brain always does the best. The brain adapts the best possible way. So the thing is, if the brain, we're looking at the areas where the brain can show its best. That's the best training for the brain. See, that's really the important thing to understand, that the brain is universal, that it's not model. So everything is mixed in the brain indivisibly. So technical term with it, it's a model. It doesn't have a modality. So it's everything in the brain cortex happens in one unit. So that's why it's a new neurology, right? So all the perspective was fragmented. Okay, so let's find the part of the brain that is responsible for the motor part. Let's find the part of the brain that is responsible for the emotional. Let's find the part which is responsible for something else, right? And then that's one thing. Then they would be thinking, okay, so these are the parts of the brain that are responsible for motor tasks. So that's a part of the brain responsible for feeding. This part of the brain responsible, I don't know, for moving the arm. This part of the brain responsible for, moving the leg, and so on. And then, of course, going to be the other parts, right? So you see like, okay, so the brain, this part of the brain controls the arm, this part of the brain controls the lip, this part of the brain controls the leg, and so on. So we intrinsically have a tendency to think this way, which is not true. The brain works together. So it's a total integration. You can't pinpoint those things. So that's why the top level of the brain is defined by the top integrated function it's able to perform. So it's a total cortex, not the isolated area. So it's not having those isolated sort of circuits and signal loops which are going selectively for the hands, feet, left, right, and so on. It's total activation for the external task. It's an ensemble of the neurons and the ensemble of the muscles. You cannot split it. So when we get back to our scales, remember what I said? I said that our job is to put as much as possible on this, on the good side of the scale, right? And what do we want? We want the maximum magnification factor, so that this magnification factor, when we get one area, one activity, and this activity helps us and benefits the others. So that's really the key. That's why I'm emphasizing the feeding so much. That feeding, on the one hand, is the first in line. The second thing, the control of the mouth, some sort of control of the mouth, is the quality that even their severe children have, because it's also based on a lot of like really hardwired presets. But the third thing is that, as we understand it from the perspective of Surprisal, interestingly enough, the most complicated task for the brain is the feeding, because it always deals with the external component. So what does it mean? If we want to develop the brain, if we want to prepare the brain and let it evolve in such a way that it will create the potential for the rest of the body, well, feeding is our best bet. So does it make sense to use feeding as utilitarian thing just to shuffle food into the child? Obviously not. Because in that sense, by downgrading your best potential, you are actually switching to doing something else which is of a lot poorer quality, right? And another thing that we want to keep in mind is that there is kind of hierarchy of qualities. And the critical part in this hierarchy of quality, so the lowest part would be when, the child cannot do anything, right? So you see, when everything is done for them, it has to be moved for them, right? So the next level would be, okay, the child can do some movement but cannot do a cycle. The third level, okay, there is some cycle, but it's poorly controlled and it requires such an effort that the child wouldn't do it. So the critical barrier, the critical step there, is the level of play, self-interest, and self-exploration. So self-exploration. So these are the key levels. So we want to bring, because once we manage to bring the child to get that at least somewhere your child has this, we are already in a very good place, because that's a potential. This is a critical step of things which could become self-developing, self-sustainable, self-evolving, as opposed to the ones when you are the one doing all the jobs for them. And now let me ask you this simple question. Where you are more likely to get this self-play, self-involvement, self-interest, self-exploration? Is it going to be with the legs or is it going to be with the mouth? I think that the practical experiential answer is very, very obvious. Most of the children show this capacity, right? Even the child who is poor in swallowing and so on and so on, they can play with their food. They mouth things in and and do all sorts of things. So my point is for you to see it. Any self activity there is fantastic. And let's put it like this on a very practical side. Even if the feeding with this play and interaction and interest and so on, even if this takes an hour, this is an hour extremely well spent. So I want you to see how it contributes to the development of the brain. And let me do one more thing, so just to anticipate your question, right? Because the question comes in, okay, so if the brain is so powerful and so, doing its best through this, why we are having such a poor performance elsewhere? So isn't it the brain that is responsible for this? So that's the key answer. And if you remember my main message that comes through the review forms and so on, what are we looking at? You see, you can always see the same pattern there. First thing I look and say, hey, let's find out what are the best properties of the situation. What are the levels that your child controls best? Even if it's just the control of the eyes, even if this is just the control of the mouth, we already having a foothold, we're already having a grip for self-development, but we want to nurture this, not kind of tick a box and say, okay, like now she can swallow or she can get the thing into the mouth. And now let's get something else. Let's train the sitting. Let's train the hands. Let's train the stepping or whatever. They try to do the crawling. So that's the main mistake. The child shows you where she or where he has this capacity. Where is their self-interest? Where this ability for self-exploration? And you tick a box, and instead of leveraging this, instead of kind of grabbing this chance and opportunity, saying, wow, finally I get something which is working by itself, so let it kind of take this thread and let it grow, like take this little sapling and nurture it. So what you're saying, okay, occupational therapist, next step, now we want big chunks, or now we want a fork, or now, like, okay, so you see we're wasting time on feeding, let's say, or the feeding is messy. I don't like it. It doesn't look tidy. She doesn't look smart when she puts the food around on her face. There's a self-killing of chances. That's a tragedy of this complete misunderstanding. Remember, we were talking about this, that there are two things: putting the right and allowing things to develop on the green side, and avoiding getting into the wrong side. This is what I see all the time. Okay, let's fast forward to the feeding. Let's get to some real action, because, well, we believe that there is, this is already, we somehow are able to do it. Let's get into the next step. But that is all old neurology, old, outdated, wrong. So that's really the big thing that I want you to see from a positive light. I want you to see from the empowerment. And on the practical side, what does it mean? It means that yourself, you need a lot more patience, right? You need a lot more patience in feeding processes, and you should be much more willing. If your child cannot eat with their own hands, you should be much more willing to get your hands dirty. Good old feeding with the hands. And I'll tell you what, right? So I must say that myself, I kind of underappreciated this for years. But if I look back in the 1990s, so my experiences with Russia, so there were two really things standing out, and then early 2000s as well. So one thing that, of course, those days there was no such thing as tubes. So it was either you find a way to feed the child or the child dies. There's nothing in between. And I met actually dozens of families who would be telling the same stories. Like they really started by just dipping the finger into the kind of pureed food and basically just putting it in and feeding. The child would literally sort of lick the finger, or somehow the food would just go through this. So at first it sounds tedious, but the level of challenge was so great that the parent didn't have any other choices. And then even later on in the zeros, when this opportunity kind of appeared for the peg buttons, still, I don't know, in the Russian psyche, it was such a stigma, right? So you see, the parents would be absolutely just horrified by this idea. So, and many of them would be just kind of doing the same thing, just in order not to put the button in. I'm not making any judgments here, and it's not a judgment call and so on, but I'm just saying that, of course, in the Western mentality overall, it's became kind of a, feeding conveyor. And all these people that are known as nutritionists, right? So you see, they're even called nutritionists. So they have all sorts of ideas about the chemistry of the food, about enrichment of the food, and all this other stuff, but they don't look at the process. The process of feeding, for them is just, it's purely like putting a fuel into the tank. Like, are you going to mess around with your car fuel tank, right? No, you just want to put the things in, and that's it. And their idea, okay, if you have some entry part broken, with getting into the gas tank, okay, so let's find a way to feed it directly into the engine. So that would be their idea. So the entire aspect of this development and the entire aspect of the feeding as the key mechanism for the evolution, development, and so on has been completely wasted. And it's already a couple of generations of those specialists. So it's even the memory of this has been more or less erased with the ideas of the pediatricians. They also been, unfortunately, like trained in this nutrition, enriched nutrition way. And of course, you all know how often, all this kind of formula, enriched formula and so on, they just don't go well. And, like besides of all the additional troubles from this gastrostomies. So my point is here, even if your channel already has it. So I believe that, this webinar for us is a good opportunity. And myself, like, look, I actually got into Mr. Friston, just last year during the quarantine. So that was a good opportunity to get into his stuff because, I tell you what, let's say he is indeed the most widely quoted neuroscientist of the world, right? With something like 200,000 citations, and it's an enormous number, right? So you see, basically an article that gets 100 citations, that's already close to kind of, it's a huge success. So this guy has more than 1,000 articles, and on average more than 200 citations per article, right? So you see, this is just incredible. But on the other hand, it's a kind of theoretical neuroscience which stays there, kind of top in the sky in the cloud. And those theoretical people, they don't bother about how this is going to descend into the real world. This is not what they are, these are academics. Academia writes articles, right? Presents things and so on. So the practical implementation is not their thing. And it's probably in the last and in the next 15, 20 years, maybe 30 years, So it's going to happen that this thing that he, that this new neurology, is going to trickle into the everyday world, but or into the practical side of your rehabilitation when it comes to your OT, PT, and so on. But where are you going to be in 20 years, right? So you see, that's really one of the challenges, is that the medical system grinds and changes its perspectives extremely slowly, and only like by natural departure of the people who were trained in the previous ways. So in that sense, it took me actually quite a serious effort to grind through his work, because nobody argues with him, but his work is highly mathematical, like highly mathematical. He's like it's for he's a neuroscientist with a lot of formula. But to convert them into at least some key practical ideas and understanding is not easy. So that's why it took me sort of several months to dig through his main points and actually fully appreciate this idea of the surprisal. Of course, it was not a difficult leap for me, because that's how what we see in reality of dealing of working with the children with disabilities. It's like that is the how you see this, that surprisal as being the most important part. So but once you start digging and thinking on this idea further, you really start to appreciate how large is this impact, right? So you see that how much of this transfer of brain development from one area into the others you can have. And this is why I want to really focus on this and say, hey guys, we have to take feeding and training through feeding, encouraging this self-exploration, jumping into this level when the child is capable of self-exploration, self-interest, and so on. All these, great properties for the training of the brain, we can get it the easy way through feeding, as opposed to doing all sorts of wrong things, trying to bring the child into standing frame, encourage them to crawl or like reach out with the hand and do all sorts of other things. And you also would understand that if the whole thing is integrated, so the more the child can do through the level which is self-available, self-exploring, right? Then it also helps in the development of the emotional stability, in the development of the emotional intelligence. It helps in the development of all other aspects of the intelligence, right? Because we understand that it's a uniform intelligence of the brain, and we want to find the way which is the easiest and the most kind of productive, the greatest multiplication factor. And in that way, I want to get back then to this. The key point here is that what we want to understand is that when we judge the brain and try to understand your child's condition, we judge it by the area and the performance which is the obvious best. But when we are judging the body, we are looking at the hidden worst. So that's a formula. And there is a great question coming here. Don't we want not to surprise the brain? That's a very good question. Really good question, right to the heart of the essence. Because you see, what happens if we surprise it in the area where the body coordination and the body perceptron, the perceptive capacities of the body are poor? Then we surprise the brain through the perception, and then the whole thing goes into the defensive, into their concentrated mode. But that's why it's so important that we see the self-explorations. You see, the self-exploration, the self-activity, the self-interest, that's exactly the part that shows us that it's a low effort, low energy expense, that it works here within that 5%, right? Remember at our previous webinar what we were talking about, besides of the specifics about the head and so on. So the central message at our previous webinar has been around this simple thing, that what we actually want, we can only judge the activities that are done at the low muscle effort. Only the things which are done, which are as close to that 5% of the muscle effort, so that's good. So 5% of the effort for 100% of activity. And anything that comes with high muscle efforts, 50%, 40%, not to mention 100%. So these are poor multiplication factors, right? We get back to the same thing. We want multiplication factors. But how do you know that there is a multiplication factor? Very simple. One is via the presence of the loop. Action, perception, action, correction, perception, and so on. So if the child is able to do loops, activities, adjustments, integrations, that's guarantees that it's a relatively lower effort. And if there is additionally all these fine sophistications and the variability, that also adds into this part. So self-interest coupled with the easy cycling and the variety of the repertoire, these are the best indicators that the surprisal there is low. I want you to be very clear there. You see, in that sense, feeding itself is the process with the greatest surprisal factor, just because of the fact that there are always the external factor there. Everything else would be lower. So hands and feet, but then sitting, standing, and so on. So those would be the lower parts of the surprisal there. But on the other hand, we look at how this particular action now, how much surprisal is in this kind of interaction. But that is going to be here the opposite, right? So you see, that's a paradox. For example, if you put the child into standing, standing itself has lesser built-in surprisal than the feeding. But of course, because of the body weaknesses and so on, the resultant surprisal is going to shoot up. That is a double benefit of the feeding. The double beauty there, it's complex, right? It's the highest built-in surprisal, but at the same time, it also performs at the best level when the child has the easiest way to develop the self-interest, self-sufficiency, and so on. So it's a win-win, as opposed to us trying to force the child into the situations with high surprisal effects. So you see, again, sitting, it's mainly internal, but of course there is this tilting component, right? So, but if that controls from the body are poor, the connections within the body are poor, so then what we're going to have, if they're not distributed enough, so then sitting itself, which is lower here, but the surprisal is going to shoot up. And that's, as I said, it's a win-win. That's why we get this additional benefit from the feeding process. But probably I haven't completed my story. Like I've kind of got distracted or sidetracked. My story about the Russia and the feeding thing. And my point is actually very simple. Those days, I was often myself surprised, right? So you see, there was a high ratio of self-surprisal, where how the child who was kind of barely supposed to die from being unable to feed, through this feeding and nothing particular else, because families, they didn't have much time for anything else, so we're actually doing well above the expectations. But those days I kind of didn't see the connection. But now, once you start putting those facts into this perspective, of the new neurology, that brings a very different understanding of the whole thing. Okay, so let's start here and kind of get the transition. So that's swallowing, right? So you see here, you see the swallowing mechanisms and this important arrow that points out at the epiglottis. So this is how the swallowing mechanism works, right? So you see, but one of the things that I really want you to consider when you look at the mouth from the side and the cross section, one of the most important and really peculiar things, how little free space you have there. For whatever reason, when we talk and we eat and so on, we don't fully appreciate the relative relationship between the size of this internal box between the upper jaw and the lower jaw, and how much it is filled in by the tongue and all the components which are sitting under it. So that you can see here that the actual free space is 20% maybe. So it's very filled up. So the thing what we are looking at is coordination, right? Coordination between the lips, between the tongue, between the muscles attached at the hyoid bone, between the neck, and then finally between the epiglottis, which provides the proper opening, and that's what has to be closed for the things not to go into the lungs, right, and go into the esophagus. So that's why we have to take into this context that anything that relates to reflux in first place starts from the top. So the total thing about the esophagus, because if you just look at the pictures like that, for example, so where you would get this sort of reflex images, so which shows you the trouble with the sphincter which allows the reflex, or this kind of pictures which are showing you just the line of the esophagus, or maybe this kind of picture which talks about the gastroesophageal reflux disease, you would hardly notice the contribution that comes from the top. You would hardly notice this contribution. So nobody really talks about it. You see here, you would be offered the idea of lifestyle modification, surgery procedures, all sorts of things, but nobody talks about the first entry point, that what you are getting in starts by how well you are being able to process things in their mouth. And that brings us back into the simple thing. Ask yourself a simple question. What is the most digestible thing that we have? So the most digestible thing that we have is saliva. So that is a perfect connection. The contents and the chemistry of saliva is perfectly fit with the contents of the juices, the gastric juices, right? Even though they're very different by chemical composition, they are complementary to each other. And we have to get one big point. Where does digestion start? Digestion starts in the mouth, and the first agent of that is saliva. So when we discuss everything related to the reflex itself, which shows you all this kind of nice acid filling up the contents of the stomach, so we have to remember that the more pre-digested is the food via the mouth, the easier is the work that to happen in the stomach itself. And it comes in two forms, right? So one form is that swallow half a potato without chewing it, right? Or just kind of bite a chunk of meat and swallow it. Or even if it's a nice vegetable, like whatever is your favorite, even it's asparagus, I don't know, whatever. Broccoli, if you just swallow it whole, what's going to happen? Well, this thing is going to get into the stomach, right? Lands there, but then digestion process, how does that happen? Well, it's a relationship between the volume and the surface. Digestion happens through the surfaces. So that's why when the food is well chewn, prepared, divided into smallest possible chunks, so then the job of the stomach is easy, right? So you see, when everything is delivered as the layers, the layer mixed and so on is easy to digest. If it's a chunk, if it's a volume that drops in, then it has to be digested kind of in the onion fashion. So you first digest the first level whilst the inner levels are still staying there. So then you have the next level, the next level, the next level, the next level. What does it mean? You need higher concentrations in order to do so, because it's not being pre-processed from the saliva. And second, you need this digestive activity, the secretion of all these enzymes and so on and so forth. You need it for longer periods of time. So if digestion takes longer, and once it happens, then the entire process gets messed up, because then the stomach itself works in cycles. It has to digest and then pass it further into the intestines. Like once the enzymes are being secreted, there is a certain optimal like number of those enzymes which could be secreted per unit of time at low cost. If you need more, it costs more. Then, like there is digestion and there is resting. During this resting, there is the repairments of the inner lining and all these other things. So if the digestion itself takes longer, then there is not enough time for the repair of the inner lining. So then the cycles, they start getting messed up. That's why my first point that I would bring continues to connect to this entry question, right? The entry question being that the more play, the more thing, the more time and it spans into the mouth, and the smaller the chunks and the greater the saliva components are, the easier it is for the digestions in that sense. So that's the number one thing. So then once we understand that, we need to move to the next part and understand what are the mechanics of this system. So you see here, you see the esophagus. There's a term muscle that closes this transition from esophagus to the stomach. And you can see that this is a continuous line, right? And then there's a stomach muscles as well. But now we're going to get to our favorite pictures. So this is our favorite picture with the illustration of the inner backing of the uh, entire abdominal space. So where we look at the presence of the iliasource, but the key thing for us is to link those two, right? So you see here, you see that's this hole. Yeah. So you see this hole that you've just seen here, right? So you see, and that is that kind of the demo of the stomach that we've seen. So it goes through what? It goes through the hole in the diaphragm. So that shows you this critical relationship between the diaphragm, respiration, how it's being done, and their issues related to reflux. That's where we have to understand this link. And again, it's quite straightforward. We discussed this thing before. In order to get sufficient inhalation, the diaphragm has to go downwards. If it goes downwards in a good way, then you get all sorts of benefits. You get the additional stimulus to this of the rising intra-abdominal pressure. You've got the things going stimulated all the way further down, and so on and so forth. So you got all these benefits to this. But now, if you need to use this lateral stretch in order to pull the diaphragm down. What's going to happen when you stretch something? What happens to holes? They tend to deform and close, right? So you see, then that stretch itself is going to create the commotion and the strange unphysiological relationship at this transition. Then, of course, it's going to come into the conflict with the stomach itself. And then, as we remember those things, we have to get back to our picture from here. Yes? So you understand that over here, that's in fact not just the muscle that closes. So it's the internal part. It's the sphincter there, but it's the diaphragm which is all the way around here. This situation is critically related on the diaphragm. That's one thing. But then what is the other thing? The pressure has to go downwards. But if your child's situation is the one when she needs to get the suction in the abdomen in order to breathe, what happens? Instead of pressure going downwards, the pressure pushes up. So in fact, it becomes suction. Instead of keeping things low, it becomes the suction that actually pulls the contents of the stomach upwards. So, and that's why I would include into this picture this one as well, right? So you see, when we look at the total thing, we have to understand this relationship. You can see here, look at this lining, this lining. So that's the lining which goes all the way up to the fifth rib level. And how strong is this lining underneath? So what we want this abdominal wall to be part of this proper pressure distribution mechanism. So it would be strong enough to contain the whole thing and to allow the pressure to distribute downwards, right? And what do we have downwards? Downwards, we have all this guts and the intestines, right? So you see, which brings us to the point of the constipation and so on. So that what happens if we don't have enough stimuli there, if we don't have this raised pressure, so then instead of pushing things downwards, everything goes up. This thing goes up, this thing goes up, this thing goes up. So that's really one of the key things. That's how we are linked back to the respiratory thing, and how the digestive thing, digestive performance is being so much dependent on the respiratory component. So that's why I keep emphasizing, keep returning to my first point from today, that in fact, these are the things, these are the transformations which are more long term. In that respect, with those long-term things, this remodeling and the relationship and the rebuilding of the diaphragm tone and the redistribution of tone and so on and so forth. So these are, of course, longer frameworks. But that's why the control of the whole thing from the feeding part and maximizing this contribution of the things which are happening inside the mouth, so getting back to the feeding process, so that's really the key. And I hope that, I started with this thing when you were relatively fresh, so that I bombarded you with the ideas about the feeding. I have this strong intention to follow up on this, right? And then from you getting the videos or things, okay, so I'm trying to switch into manual feeding. Let's see how it works. Let's see if I'm holding it there for long enough, what happens, how well the child is getting readjusted to this thing, and so on. So I'm really happy to support you on this, right? I'm really happy to watch those videos and kind of give you the additional advice, encouragement, or maybe some kind of correction, of course, and so on. So we really want to follow up on this and to see this, and really kind of to be true to this understanding that feeding and that self-exploration of the activity there is really the greatest possible contribution we can make towards the brain development and that sort of ability to handle the surprisals.